The risen Jesus had 40 days walking the earth after he came out of the tomb. He spoke to people. He ate meals with them. He let them touch him, and he did not appear, not once, to a single person who deserved it. I have been sitting with that for a long time, and I have to be honest with you about what it does to me. The risen Jesus did not appear to the people who should have seen him first. He did not appear to Pilate. He did not appear to Caiaphas. He did not appear to the Senate of Rome, or to the priests of Jerusalem, or to the soldier who pressed the crown of thorns into his head. It is stranger than that. He did not appear, not once, to a single person who had not already failed him. That is the pattern. I have spent a long time looking at it, and once you see it, you cannot stop seeing it. Mary Magdalene saw him first. She had stood at the cross, but the text is careful with the language. Mark chapter 15, verse 40 says she stood looking on from afar, from a distance. She had not stood next to him. The disciples in the upper room had locked the doors out of fear. They had fled the night he was arrested. Every one of them. Mark chapter 14, verse 50 says it in 5 words, and they all left him. Thomas had said, out loud in front of his friends, that he would not believe Jesus was alive unless he could put his finger in the wounds. James, the brother of Jesus, the boy who had grown up under the same roof as him, had said the man was crazy. He had said it with the rest of the family. Mark chapter 3, verse 21. And Saul, the man who would become Paul, was on a road heading north to find more Christians to arrest, when the risen Jesus appeared to him with a question. Not a sermon. A question. Every named person Jesus appeared to had failed him. Not one of them got it right the first time. Not one. And here is what I have to be honest about. There is one appearance in the New Testament that is mentioned twice and described 0 times. Luke mentions it. Paul mentions it. The Gospels do not narrate it. It is the first one, the very first appearance after the tomb. And we have no record of what was said. We will come back to it. We have to start somewhere else first. But before we go any further, I want you to hear this once because it is going to come back. This is the story of a man who came back from a tomb and of what he did in the days that followed. He came back looking. Friday afternoon. The sky goes dark. Nobody understands what is happening yet. The disciples have already scattered. Peter is somewhere in the city denying he ever knew the man. Once, twice, 3 times. The rooster, the look across a courtyard. John alone is at the foot of the cross, holding up Mary, the mother of Jesus. The women are watching from a distance. Mary Magdalene is one of them. And then the man on the middle cross dies. The body is taken down. Joseph of Arimathea wraps it and places it in his own new tomb. The stone is rolled. The sun sets. The Sabbath begins. And then comes Saturday. There's no comfortable way to say this. Saturday is the longest day in the Bible. The text gives us almost nothing about it. A few verses. The disciples are hiding. The women are preparing spices. Pilate is asleep. The chief priests are asking for the tomb to be guarded because they remember something Jesus said about 3 days, even though his own followers have forgotten. The world goes on, and somewhere in the dark of a borrowed grave, the body of the man who said he was God lies still. This is the day after. Every person who has ever lost something they cannot get back has lived in it. And if you have ever lived through Saturday, the long quiet after the worst, you know exactly what that air feels like. Now, I want to step out of the story for 1 minute, because there is a question that skeptics have been asking about the resurrection for 2,000 years, and I do not want to skip it. The question is this: if Jesus rose from the dead on Sunday morning, why didn't he appear to Pilate? Why not to Caiaphas? Why not to Caesar's Senate? Why not show up in the temple courts the next morning and end every argument that would ever come? Philosophers have been raising versions of this question for centuries. David Hume in the 1700s, Bertrand Russell in the 1900s, atheist YouTubers every week, and they are not asking it in bad faith. They have a real point, because if you wanted to prove you had risen from the dead, that is exactly the opposite of what you would do. I have thought about this for a long time, and here is the honest answer. I do not think the resurrection appearances were ever meant to be proof. I do not think the question is wrong. I think the question is in the wrong key. This is not a story about proof. This is not a story about evidence. This is not a story about winning an argument. This is a story about a God who walked out of a tomb and went looking, by name, for the specific people who had broken his heart. If you came back from the dead to prove a point, you would appear to Caesar. If you came back from the dead to find someone, you would appear to Mary. That is the entire difference. The question is real, and the answer is real too. He came back looking, one, by name, for the people who had failed him. Sunday, first light. The Sabbath is over. The women are walking to the tomb. They have spices and oil. They expect to anoint a body that has been there since Friday evening. They are not coming because they believe. They are coming because someone has to do this work, and the men are gone. Mary Magdalene gets there first. The stone is rolled away. The tomb is open. The body is not there. I have to stop here for a minute because I need to clear something up about Mary that has been wrong for almost 1,400 years. Mary Magdalene was not a prostitute. The Bible never says she was. Not once. The only thing the Bible tells us about her past is that Jesus had cast 7 demons out of her. Luke chapter 8, verse 2. That is the entire backstory. 7 demons. We do not know what that means medically, spiritually, historically. The text does not specify. We know she was sick. We know she was healed. We know she stayed with him after. The prostitute story comes from a sermon. Pope Gregory I in Rome on September 14th, 591 A.D., homily number 33. He confused her with 2 other women in the Gospels, Mary of Bethany and the unnamed sinful woman who anointed Jesus' feet in Luke chapter 7. He merged the 3 into one figure. He preached it, and the smear stuck. It took the Catholic Church almost 1,400 years to officially correct it. Pope Paul VI did it in 1969. Almost 14 centuries of being called something she was not. Cleared in a single line of an updated calendar. Here is what nobody told me. The first witness to the resurrection of Jesus Christ was a woman the world spent more than 1,000 years calling a name she did not deserve. And God knew the truth about her every single one of those days. He knows what the world has called you. He knows what you have called yourself. He has not signed off on either. So, back to that garden. Mary is alone. She has come back to the tomb after running to fetch Peter and John. They have looked inside, seen the empty linens, and gone home. She is standing outside the tomb crying. She bends down to look in. 2 angels are sitting there. They ask her why she is weeping. She tells them. And then she turns around, and there is a man standing behind her. She thinks it is the gardener. She says, and picture this. This is a grown woman speaking through tears to a stranger she believes is a groundskeeper. She says, "Sir, if you have taken him, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." She does not have a plan. She just wants to hold him. Even if he is dead, the man says one word, "Mary," and she turns, and she answers with one word, "Rabboni." That word is Aramaic. The Greek text could have used a standard word for teacher, didaskalos. John keeps the Aramaic on purpose. He keeps it because that is the word that actually left her mouth, and Rabboni is not just teacher, it is my teacher, the personal possessive. He had called her name. She answered with claim. She runs back to the 11 and tells them she has seen the Lord. Mark chapter 16, verse 11 says it bluntly. They did not believe her. The first preacher of the resurrection, the first person to say the words, "I have seen the Lord," was a woman whose testimony the men dismissed. The early church remembered this. They gave her a title that the New Testament does not use, but that the church fathers did. Apostle to the apostles. The apostle who was sent to the apostles with the most important message in human history by a man they had abandoned. He came back looking, and the first person he found was the one who had stood farthest away. That same Sunday afternoon, 2 men are walking out of Jerusalem on the road to a village called Emmaus. Luke chapter 24, verse 13. One of them is named Caiaphas. The other is not named. I want you to notice what direction they are walking. They are walking away from Jerusalem. They are not the disciples in the upper room. They are not the women at the tomb. They are 2 followers of Jesus who watched him die on Friday, heard rumors of an empty tomb on Sunday morning, and decided to go home. Whatever they had believed in, it had not happened. They had given the man 3 years of their lives. They were walking the 7 miles back to their old town. They were done. You know what that walk looks like. You have walked it, and on that road, the risen Jesus joins them. He pretends not to know what happened. He asks them what they are talking about. They stop walking. Caiaphas looks at him and says one of the saddest lines in the gospel. Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened these days? Jesus walks the rest of the way to Emmaus with them. He explains the scriptures to them. He stays for dinner. He breaks bread. And the moment they recognize him, he disappears. I have thought about this for a long time. The reason he vanishes the second they see him is that the lesson is finished. You have already seen him. You walked 7 miles with him. You just did not know. They get up. They walk those 7 miles back to Jerusalem that same night, in the dark. Later that same Sunday night, the 11 disciples, minus Thomas, who is not there for reasons the Bible does not give us, are locked in a room. John chapter 20, verse 19 says it directly. The doors of the house where the disciples were locked for fear of the Jews. They have just been told by Mary that she has seen the Lord. They have just been told by Caiaphas and his companion, who came running back from Emmaus, that they have seen the Lord. And they are still locked in. They are still afraid. Faith does not always move at the speed we want it to. Jesus walks through the locked doors. He stands in the middle of the room. And his first words to the men who fled the night he was arrested, the men who left him to die alone, are these, "Peace be with you." He says it twice. John records it twice, verses 19 and 21. Once to settle them, once to send them. Not where were you? Not why did you leave? Peace. 1 week later, Thomas is in the room. The other 10 have been telling him for 7 days that they saw the Lord, and Thomas has been saying out loud in front of them that he will not believe it. He says, "Unless I see the print of the nails and put my finger in them, I will not believe." He has been a follower of Jesus for 3 years. He is now publicly refusing to believe what every other person in the room is telling him. And Jesus comes back into that locked room, and he goes directly to Thomas, not to anyone else, to Thomas. I want you to notice what he does not do. He does not rebuke him. He does not embarrass him in front of the others. He does not lecture him about a week of doubt. He just offers him the wounds. Reach here. Put your finger here. Put your hand into my side. Stop doubting and believe. And Thomas, the man who needed evidence the most, gives the highest confession of Christ in the New Testament. My Lord and my God. He does not say, my teacher. He does not say, my king. He says, my God. The doubter spoke the truest sentence about Jesus that any disciple ever spoke. Tradition holds that Thomas later traveled to India and was martyred there. We need to be careful with that. It is not in the Bible. It comes from a 3rd century writing called the Acts of Thomas. Historians lean on it, but we should not present it as scripture. 3 failures, 3 encounters, each one found in a different way. The 2 walking away. He joined them and walked 7 miles in the wrong direction with them until they could see. The ones locked in. He walked through the door and said peace before anything else. The one who demanded proof. He gave it without a single word of rebuke. None of those failures were obstacles. They were addresses. There is one more appearance I have been holding back. I told you at the beginning that we would come back to it. Here it is. It is the first one. Luke chapter 24, verse 34 says it in one sentence. The Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon. That is the entire account. No scene, no dialogue, just he appeared to him. Paul says it again in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 5. He appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Cephas, not Peter. Paul could have used the Greek name, Petros. Most of the New Testament uses Petros. Paul reaches past the Greek and uses the Aramaic. Cephas is the name Jesus personally gave Simon on the day they met. John chapter 1, verse 42. It is the most personal name available. It is what Jesus had called him. And in the resurrection list, Paul does not say Peter the apostle saw him. He says Cephas. He uses the name Jesus gave the man when he tells you that Jesus came to find him. But here is what I cannot get past. We do not know what they said. The Bible does not tell us. The Gospels do not narrate it. We learn about it from a single line on the Emmaus Road, when the two travelers return to Jerusalem and find the 11 already saying, "The Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." What did Jesus say when he walked into the room where Peter was? Did he embrace him? Did he wait for the apology? Did Peter weep? Did Peter try to explain himself before Jesus stopped him? We do not know. We will never know. And maybe you would not want to know either. Some conversations are too private for an audience. I have thought about this for a long time, and I think the silence is the point. That conversation was not for us. It was not for me. It was for Peter. The first thing the risen Jesus did, before the upper room, before Thomas, before any group meeting, was to find privately the man who had denied him publicly, and what was said between them was kept between them, because it was not our business. It was his. If you have ever had a conversation with God in the dark that you have never told another human being, Peter had that conversation first. The Bible left it out for a reason, because some restorations do not need an audience. Then there is James, the brother of Jesus. You have to understand who this is. James grew up under the same roof as Jesus. He had watched his older brother begin to preach and had said, with the rest of the family, that the man was out of his mind. Mark chapter 3, verse 21. John chapter 7, verse 5 says it more bluntly, for not even his brothers believed in him. And then 1 Corinthians 15, verse 7 gives us one line. Then he appeared to James. That is it. No drama, no reconstruction, just he appeared. And James, who had thought his brother was crazy, became the leader of the church in Jerusalem. He was stoned to death for his brother in the year 62. The Jewish historian Josephus records his execution. Antiquities, Book 20, Chapter 9. The brother who said he was crazy died for him. And then, last, there is Saul, a young man holding the coats of the people stoning Stephen, the first Christian martyr. Acts chapter 7, verse 58. A few chapters later, he is going to Damascus with letters of arrest, ravaging the church, dragging men and women into prison. Acts chapter 8, verse 3. He is, at that moment, the church's most committed enemy. He has government letters in his bag. He has a list of names. He is riding north to do exactly what they did to Stephen, but on a larger scale. And on the road to Damascus, the risen Jesus stops him with a question. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Saul falls. He is blind for 3 days. He does not eat. He does not drink. Acts chapter 9, verse 9. He is found by a Christian named Ananias, a man who, when God told him to go heal the most wanted criminal in the church, reasonably objected. And Ananias goes anyway. He lays hands on the man who had come to arrest him, and the scales fall off Saul's eyes. Saul becomes Paul. He spends the rest of his life telling people that the risen Jesus is still looking for the ones who do not deserve to be found. And in his own list of resurrection witnesses, 1 Corinthians 15, verse 8, he uses a word for himself that is one of the most violent self-categorizations in the New Testament. The Greek word is ektroma. It is usually translated untimely born, but the real meaning is harsher. It means miscarriage, stillbirth, an aborted thing. Paul, in his own list of the people Jesus came back for, calls himself the resurrection's miscarriage, the failure who should never have been born into this, the one who was killing them when Jesus found him. He places that word inside the resurrection list, right next to Mary, right next to Peter, right next to James, as if to say, yes, the risen Jesus came for all of them, including me, including the one of us who least deserved it, including the one of us who was the enemy. Mary was not the exception. Peter was not the exception. Thomas was not the exception. The exception was the rule. The rule was the resurrection's method. He came back looking. He found the woman who stood at a distance. He found the disciple who denied him 3 times. He found the brother who said he was crazy. He found the man who was killing his followers. He came back looking, by name, one at a time. There was a man named Brennan Manning. He died in 2013. Most people outside of Christian circles never heard of him. Most people inside them have. He was a Franciscan priest, ordained in 1963. He left the priesthood in 1982 to marry. His marriage ended in 2000 because of his alcoholism. He spent his life writing about grace. He spent his life failing to live up to it. He wrote one of the most read books on grace in the 20th century, The Ragamuffin Gospel, and he kept drinking. He went to rehab. He relapsed. He went sober. He relapsed again. He missed his own mother's funeral because he was on a bender. And then he wrote books that millions of recovering people read in their first sober weeks and felt for the first time in years that maybe they were not too far gone. In his memoir, written near the end of his life, he wrote a sentence I have not been able to forget. He wrote, "I've been John the Beloved, Peter the Coward, and Thomas the Doubter, all before the waitress brought the check. All of them, all in one afternoon, all before lunch ended. He died still struggling. He died still loved. He died still found." The risen Jesus did not wait for Brennan Manning to stop being Peter before he found him as Peter. That is the story this video has been telling you, in different voices, for the last 20 minutes. So here's what I want to leave you with. 3 things that have been sitting with me through all of this. First, the truth. Every named person Jesus appeared to after the resurrection had failed him. Mary stood at a distance. Peter denied him. The disciples fled. Thomas refused to believe. James said he was crazy. Saul was killing his followers. There is not one resurrection witness in the New Testament who got it right the first time. Not one. The pattern is the message. Then, what that pattern means for you. If you are listening to this, and you are thinking about the way you have failed someone you love, or the way you have failed God, or the way you have failed yourself this week, you are not outside the story. You are inside it. You are exactly the kind of person the risen Jesus went looking for first, not after you fix it, not after you make it right. First, privately, by name. And the third, the one I have not been able to stop thinking about. There is one resurrection appearance the Bible never describes. I think the reason it does not is because the Bible is not finished writing them. There is a version of that conversation for every person who has ever heard their own name spoken in the dark and wondered if it was the wind. It was not the wind. The risen Jesus is still looking, and he calls each person by name. He will call yours. He came back looking, and he is still looking, and he calls each person by name. Which one of them sounds most like you right now? Mary, who stood at a distance. Peter, who denied him to a servant girl's face. Thomas, who needed to put his finger in the wounds. The 2 on the road to Emmaus, walking away. James, who thought he was crazy. Saul, who was killing his followers. Tell me in the comments, one name. You do not have to explain why. The risen Jesus has spent 2,000 years answering that exact question. Take care of yourself tonight. He is looking for you.